the thing about entrepreneurship is really, how do you improve yourself? How do you improve the thing that you've just made?
Yeah.
And to think that, no, this is just going to be perfect. It's the market's fault. They're just not ready for it. Well, I think then it requires a re-examination of what it is that you're doing and why you're doing.
This is Preti, and you're listening to Millennials Boleh, the show which is all about millennials. Hi listeners, welcome to this week's episode of Millennials Boleh. Our topic for this week is Millennials Boleh, be entrepreneurial. Joining us to discuss this topic is the exceptional radio personality, Ezra Zaid. Ezra is the host and creator of the podcast, the Ezra Zaid Project. Welcome, Ezra. How are you today?
I'm doing good, Preti. How are you?
I'm good, thanks.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yes, it's really exciting to have you on because, I think something that I should share is I was a, real fan of yours, since your BFM days and then now with the podcast. So it's almost like it's a bit of a surreal moment.
And it's also nice to hear that you've started this thing, and it's quite scary and exciting to be building something from scratch. So I completely know where you're coming from, and happy to be here and talk to you on your podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a very exciting journey, and it's nice to have someone else to support it.
Yeah,
which is great. Yeah, right. So I think we'll go in straight into the questions. So we've got quite a few, but I think it'll be quite an interesting episode having you on and with your perspective. So I'll start off with the first question. So the premise of this episode, as we know, is entrepreneurship. So Ezra, to start us off, could you give us some background on your experience with entrepreneurship?
Right. It's been an interesting one and a rocky and exciting one, because I graduated in university about 2006, and I was working in Canada for a bit, and then finally when I returned back home, due to family considerations and just coming back home, there was a lot of discussion within my family. Oh, what are we going to do? Help out with the family business and such. And at the time, at the beginning of my entrepreneurship journey was basically supporting my father's dreams of publishing books, and I didn't sort of quite oppose it, and I enjoyed books, so I thought, okay, I think I can learn something from here. So I began by publishing books, and at the time I knew only as much as anybody else did, which was, you go to a bookstore, there are books on the shelves, but I didn't know how books got there. I didn't know the distribution that was required. I didn't know the publishing options, that you had to read so many manuscripts. I didn't know that there was an editing process. I didn't know that you had to go through all of these different things. And in doing that, I ended up doing it for sort of quite seriously for about 5 to 6 years. But at the same time, I also noticed that, at the time, digital media was just about to kick in sort of a real meaningful way with YouTube and everything else. So suddenly, 3 and 4 years into my publishing journey, where we were publishing, I think, probably a book a month, which meant, it's constantly sort of looking at what is the next title? What is the next title? And then at the same time, I began doing a YouTube show. And this was at a time when the internet connectivity wasn't terrific in the country. And as a result, we had to build our own players. YouTube wasn't steady enough. And so we made videos every week, and we started just doing things on that journey. And over time, that little endeavor of making a video every weekend suddenly became something that we could get paid for. And we got paid for that, and suddenly we built a company. And then suddenly we started hiring people because we needed more people to do it and more efficiently. Yeah. And then this is a little bit sort of a compression, but because of that YouTube show and because of that company and having making videos for clients and different brands, somehow it got my foot into the door at BFM, because they needed presenters, and maybe they needed another spectacle fella just talking to a microphone, who knows. But they offered me a chance at the microphone. 1 month went on and they weren't kicking me out of the studio. 2 months went on, and then I go, oh, okay, maybe they don't know any better. And so then 9 years on, that was the extent of being at BFM. But my entrepreneurship journey in that sense was really quite limited to the publishing and the creating of content, from whether it was books or whether it was making videos. And it was fascinating because we started off in almost like a small bedroom of sorts, in a friend's house. And it ended up an office in Menara Bata where you had maybe staff of 20 people, and it got big in a very fast in a very exciting way. But there were a lot of mistakes and a lot of failures that you had to learn from very, very quickly, because you were always trying to, I guess, chase the next thing, and you're trying to do so many things at such different levels of speed that we weren't as focused as to who we were and what we were. We were trying to accommodate and be everything to every client. We were trying to be a distribution channel. We were trying to be a content creation company. We were trying to be copywriters. We were trying to be everything to what the market wanted. And I think in some ways that experience gave me a lot of positive things, in that I got to know so many people within the industry and create all of these networks and relationships in which I still employ and have today, that I still have collaborators that I work with today. But when I think back about that, it was just almost a rush of trying to create something, get paid, make sure your staff gets paid. And it was there was so much chutzpah, but not enough focus to really sort of have a sense of what that was. And I think now, scaling things down, having left a salaried company and doing this podcast, the Ezra Zaid Project, I'm trying to sort of scale down what it is exactly that I'm trying to offer. Because being an entrepreneur, for that's the buzzword for the past 10 years. I've been hearing it in my head for too long. Being an entrepreneur essentially means, creating something of value, and that you can earn something from it while you're asleep. In comparison to when you're a freelancer, you work when you're awake, and that's what you get paid for very much. But your entrepreneurship is about creating something of value and putting it out there in the world, and you getting paid even though you're not sort of functioning when you're asleep, so to speak. So in that sense, it's been trying to sort of make sense of a lot of those lessons learned through that period. And being involved in management in my most recent job at BFM was also another lesson of that. So it went through this entire thing of, what is it that I can do? What are the skills that I have that I can offer? What can I make? Does it have value in the market? And can I scale that? And it was a wonderful journey, and I'm still going through that journey. But it's something now more. So I never thought that I would be an entrepreneur. I mean, I graduated with an arts degree and was very uncertain. It was very quite clear that the value of the degree didn't really translate to a job in the market. I knew that even when I was about to graduate, because you could see almost the market not really reflecting any of those aspects to it. So
would you, so I guess from what you've told me, it was sort of accidental that you went into entrepreneurship. It was through your sort of through sort of the experiences that you were having and the content that you were creating, that you found out that this could actually be a way to earn an income as well. So I guess in a sense it was, it's quite like with entrepreneurs, when we talk about content creators and people who produce content in a digital form, it's quite a modern form of entrepreneurship, isn't it? So yeah, it's quite interesting to hear that part of your story.
It was completely accidental, and of course, in some ways, it was also very strange, because you want to tell your immediate family that this is what I do. And for the longest time, when I had this digital content company, they weren't quite sure exactly, so what is it that you, because they didn't have anything tangible. When I was a publisher, it was easier almost that I publish books and I sell them at the store. But once things went digital, it was almost well, then you weren't, the people around you couldn't give you support because they didn't quite understand it, so to speak. And then you felt that, well, but this is where the market and the industry is going, and this is how people are consuming things. So you want to be part of that train. And you know, there's this book, I think it's called Crossing the Chasm, where you know, you have early adopters, and there's a dip before the mainstream actually takes on. And sometimes people who make stuff, and they're just so early in the game where people go, oh, that's nice and cute. But if you wait a little bit more, 5-6 years later on, it finally hits the mainstream. But by then, you might not have actually lasted long enough to actually be able to capture the wave that you will finally do. And I started making online videos in 2010, right? We're in 2021, and kids in primary school are making videos of their phones. Now, had I continued on making videos, I always wonder, oh man, had I just held on for that, because I was making it for about 5-6 years consistently. And but in the end, you needed to sort of respond to where your interests were. And at that point in time, making videos, remarkably, I didn't find any more passion in doing so. And that's where turning to the microphone, into radio, into a faceless version of content, became something. And of course, now it's this space where everything's open now, right? Video, audio, text, whatever people want, people get. So I think it's just trying to find that convergence as to what is it that I would actually like to do. Hopefully the market can meet me somewhere in the middle where they can value it. And then if someone can, if you can get paid for it, even better.
Yeah. No, I think that's the gold standard, isn't it? Like you go through that process. It's a passion, I guess. I think a lot of these projects, like podcasting and even creating content, I would like to think that it comes from an interest that a person has, wanting to produce and to share content that they value and that they hope other people will value. And in that process, if revenue comes from that, that's like a big plus, a big bonus, I think, in all of these projects.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. So if we were just to look back at the stint where we were making, so it started off with it was a show called That Effing Show, and kids have to YouTube this show because it was so long ago. But that show that we made, it was political satire, had a little bit of comedy, and it traveled. I knew that it traveled because I noticed that people say, hey, are you that guy on YouTube? And so. And what happened thereafter was that the show in itself didn't actually, it generated a lot of value and buzz, but nobody was actually willing to pay for it. But what happened was that we created products, other types of content products that were not related. And so it ended up being that effing show was the calling card that became this opportunity for us to make different things for different brands. And it was this very interesting thing where, oh, I can do a little bit of both. And so suddenly you scale it to doing 2 videos a week, and suddenly it's 3 videos a week for 3 different verticals. And so one is for a product that talks about the community, one talks about making videos for, it was all sorts of different things. And then you realize, okay, so but then you needed to figure out what exactly it is that you value. And I think trying to make sure that it became sustainable was a key thing, except that sustainability is something that requires some foresight and strategy, because it ended up being, there was too much excitement, and you're young, you work day and night, and there was a lack of focus in some sense.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting, because I think it's really interesting to see how the market has changed. And I think, the way that entrepreneurs have sort of found an avenue, to make content and to produce it and to make revenue from it has also sort of shifted in a lot of ways. So would you say, Ezra, that that maybe entrepreneurship is a natural path for millennials? Do you think we will inevitably sort of become entrepreneurs in one way or another?
Never thought to say it, but yeah.
Okay.
And I say this because I think, I guess, I'm a millennial. I'm one of those like early millennials, and you had a peak at, I guess, before us was Gen X, I guess, right?
Yeah.
So you had a peak really at that generation where people who found jobs in companies who would stay there for 20, 30 years, that was still within my rear view, in that everybody I knew were working in companies. And for much of my maybe early adult life, I was convinced that was going to be I just needed to find a company in space that would hire me, and that was where I would be. I had no idea that my career path would be doing so many different things all at the same time, all rewarding, all getting paid. But I didn't know that was going to be the deal. I didn't know that was something that was going to happen, because it was in complete contrast to, my mom worked at ICI and she got paid, at the end of the month. And, my auntie worked at this company for X amount of years. So in that sense now, with all sorts of considerations with rising costs and trying to make sure that you have enough for retirement, it is almost impossible not to have multiple things going on at the same time. So now I can sit here quite comfortably. The things that I was doing, 3, 4, 5 things at the same time, I realized that has given me the stamina and the grit to figure out, okay, this is what I need now to do. It is, I must say, quite daunting for a young person to go through. It's daunting because it feels like you're a hamster on a cycle that doesn't have an end point. And I think that's where I am at this stage right now, where I'm trying to sort of slow things down and actually build something of real value for myself and the market, so that you can sort of do it at a sort of a better pace, a pace where there is some work-life balance. And it is very challenging, especially if you live in Kuala Lumpur. In every income bracket that you belong to, some challenges are harder than others, but this is a tough city to live in that sense. With everything that, we're a community that supports our family, friends, and we don't live in isolation. And as a result, there's all sorts of backups that one needs to do. So it is not surprising that somebody is doing social media content and selling cookies at the same time. But I think to the question of whether millennials are sort of suited to this, I think so, even more so because this phone has given us so much opportunity and bandwidth. Now it's actually just a case of trying to figure out, what do we do? What do you want to do about it? And and because there's so much noise going out there in terms of what one can do. People making money in all sorts of different ways. Explaining to a relative what an NFT is a nightmare as you can get. But these are some of the things where the conversations about how somebody can earn something, the technology that's taking place right now, it's at a frightening speed, but it's also got so much opportunity to it as well.
I think it's that accessibility that we have, don't we, as millennials? And I guess we're termed as the digital sort of natives in a sense. But I think in a way we have that power of knowing what to do with a piece of technology. And we're constantly discovering as well, but we have that accessibility. And I think we're finding ways to make something out of that knowledge that we have with technology. And I think that's where entrepreneurship could be, that sort of extra option that we have. And I think that discussion that we're having, would you like to say something to that before?
No, yeah, I think the technology is very, very exciting. And I think one of the things that I've sort of come around to is actually, so I have a conversation with a friend of mine, and we talk about sort of entrepreneurship and business all the time, right? And a lot of what I do, for example, is based on creativity and whatever type of artistry that one can offer on the table. And it's really quite funny finding that sort of middle point. And because when I was younger, I think it was a lot of, well, this is what I've made, and if you don't like it, so be it. And having to negotiate that and having different experiences about how to negotiate one's, expression or voice or value and effort, it's kind of like making a cake, right? You think that that is the best cake that you've ever made, but the market wants it slightly different. And and there's a lot of it's got to do with your ego as well, and trying to make sure that you can find that sort of center. And I think it's really interesting that I have a greater capacity now to actually listen to what the market wants, and rather than just stick to the ways in which I was doing it in my mid-20s, which was, I'll publish any book I want, I'll make any video I want, and the market will love it. And it doesn't work like that, right? It works when you meet, it's I think Aristotle's golden mean. It's all about things in the center seem to have greater resonance, and having an acceptance to say, oh, maybe that's one way to do it. And changing that perspective has been a huge learning curve for me, because you can get very sort of stuck in your ways about how something should be. And
I think that in a way that comes from, I guess, the autonomy that we have when we're creators, isn't that? Because we're sort of deciding the kind of content that we're sort of, producing. We come up with the plan and the ideas. So we do have a kind of, we want to sort of keep it in a certain way, because, that's, it's almost like
there's a purity to it.
Yeah, it's our thing. And so we want to keep the integrity that we have sort of created from it. So yeah, I think it's really interesting what you say, because it is a two-way thing in the end, isn't it? Especially when it gets to the market, and if you want to make revenue from it, it has to, there will be another party that comes into that as well.
Well, and so the revenues thing is important because it keeps the lights on. But the point that I think I was also trying to make is that if you're a creative person and you make things and you're proud of them, which every right you should be, the thing that you're always dealing with is relevance, right? Everybody says that they're proud of what they've made, but there's a difference between 50 people liking it and 50,000 people liking it.
Yeah.
And if you're going to tell me that 50,000, well, let me tell you, when that number moves to 500,000 people who like it, suddenly you're going, okay, maybe well, what is it that I just did? Sometimes when you have a success, a moment of success, so sometimes I've always looked at books that I've published and that have done well. And I'm going, why did that one do well? I didn't think that was going to do well. Or why did that video hit 200,000 views, but that one hit 50,000 views? And like you've put in the same sort of structure and effort. And sometimes having sort of that macro perspective and, a slice of humble pie, saying, okay, maybe that there are indicators and there are data points that indicate this is what resonates. And at least just sort of writing it down and knowing what exactly those things are is terribly important, because I mean, this is my view, but the brain is such a horrible recall device. Like, if you write a song and you have a great melody and you don't record it, like, you're never ever going to get the melody back because it's gone. Yeah. Something about, like, I can't remember what the quote was, but something with the pen is better than not having written anything at all, right? In terms of recalling something. And having that macro perspective is terribly important, because you need to be able to analyze, look at your work, have feedback that's actually effective. And essentially, the thing about entrepreneurship is really, how do you improve yourself? How do you improve the thing that you've just made? Yeah. And to think that, no, this is just going to be perfect. It is just it's the market's fault. They're just not ready for it. Well, I think then it requires a re-examination of what it is that you're doing and why you're doing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, no, I think that is kind of a perspective to have as a millennial, because I think just going back slightly, I think as millennials we can be quite, sort of hard-headed with what we're sort of producing. And I think it's important for us to realize as well that there is an end user, and there is someone that's in the middle in that process, and that person in the middle can actually have a great impact on the end user. So yeah, I would just like to sort of talk a little bit about entrepreneurship and the kind of entrepreneurship that we have amongst millennials. So some example of some of the examples that we have of millennial entrepreneurship, which seems to be on the rise. They include startups. We talk about side hustles. So what does this tell us about the business goal for millennials? Are millennials interested in creative ventures, or do you think there's a different drive that comes into play?
I would hazard a guess that I think it's a combination of those things you mentioned, but I think it's the thing that we spoke about earlier, about how accessibility and opportunity now is really it's that in itself is so exciting. And when you add onto the thing of applying the thing that you actually like doing, I mean, for example, just and I don't go to the gym very often and stuff, but I have many friends who are working in the fitness industry. The fitness industry in the past 5-6 years is such an interesting indicator about how someone can do what they want with passion, with a phone, create content, suddenly become an instructor, and you immediately can sort of like elevate yourself to, and so many people are doing that. And that's just in one industry. Of course, we've seen that in the F&B industry, and especially with the lockdown period, suddenly everybody's baking and everybody's selling some sort of delicious dish, and it's terrific. But I think then there's a lot of, I think what we're also seeing with the advent of this, so there's a lot of stops and starts, which is completely part and parcel of the experience. I think a lot of people might be concerned about, as am I, a lot of people concerned about, I guess, it not ending up where they thought it would be and pivoting along the way, because failure is such a, whatever people sort of assign meaning to that word failure. Some people call it a hiccup, and pivoting to what you thought it thought it was and what it can be is probably one of the key things that I think about all the time. When I started my podcast, I have a way of thinking where it's got to be just perfect. It's got to be just perfect. And I've been doing that for a long time. And I've been trying to sort of like reduce those things, because I think that there needs to be a little bit of give. It needs to be a little bit more organic about how things go. And the moment I uploaded my first episode and clicked upload, it was in that moment that I go, I don't think the next episode is ever going to be like that ever again. Because suddenly you realize through the experience and the journey of it that you can make it anything you want. And it doesn't need, I think having very specific ideas and a strategy and tactical formations about what you want to do, I think that's great. But if you're not living and experiencing and feeling it at the same time, I think you're missing out something sort of terribly important, because then you're closing off opportunities, you're closing off collaborations that you never thought you would do. And as a result, you end up creating different products or different things of value that you may not have sort of initially thought of, but as a result of these sort of experiences, you can identify, oh, actually that makes a lot more sense. And suddenly you shift. Suddenly 80-20 becomes maybe 20-20-60, and because 60 is bringing in the revenue, but I still have 40% where I can do my thing. This is like, I didn't plan that out. So there's something about a lot of my process right now is literally actually examining my process. Examining process is the most important thing, because I think you can do anything right now as long as you have a computer or even a smartphone. The services that you can offer with where things are. I mean, I think just this past year, just how people have worked from home, it's just been such a remarkable notion and idea. I mean, it's suffocating on all sorts of levels, and it's troubling issues about mental health and all that. But in terms of, you know, people still being able to make a living from their living rooms, it's amazing. But I think that's where it is. I think it's looking and examining that process and trying to improve it each time.
And I think what it tells us about, I mean, whether it's millennials or humans in general, I think it tells us that, you know, we're quite malleable, and I think we can adjust our process to fit a requirement, you know, because it became a requirement, you know, working from home. There was no other way. So, but it's interesting how we even went through that learning curve. It was a huge learning curve. I mean, if I'm to reflect on my day job, which is the fact that I'm a teacher, you know, we talked about, you know, going into technology and bringing in technology in some way in our teaching. And then we just went full blown into online teaching. And it was such a huge learning curve because we didn't have anything to sort of fall back on, right?
And it's a crazy thing about, it wasn't just you, right? It was the entire teaching profession right across the country. You had, I met a teacher in Perlis, and she was showing me the things that she was doing on her iPad, and she's I mean, it was just fascinating because she had been wanting this sort of digital push within the school forever, and suddenly it just accelerated. And I mean, you know, a lot of us are not even sort of naturally quite ready to figure out what happens when quote unquote normalcy returns.
No, I think it's interesting. And I think, and there's also a downside to that as well, you know, with the positives that we went through, you know, we learned lots of things and all that, but then there's also a kind of like a feedback that we got from, I guess that it's more of like a reflective feedback in a sense, you know, feedback that we got from experiencing that, you know, some things might not just work. Some things just don't work online. Like, you know, with teaching, there are certain things that we cannot take away from face-to-face teaching. And I think it's like that with a lot of different professions that we talk about. So yeah, it's interesting that we all went through that. So I think it would be good to share a little bit of information, you know, a sort of concerning statistic now that I would like to share, but I would like your opinion on it. So according to the Department of Statistics Malaysia, so the unemployment rate of fresh graduates increased by 17% since the enforcement of the movement control order. Now, this is officially speaking. The numbers are likely higher. But we know, you know, unemployment really has been something that we've heard a lot. But, you know, obviously there's been a huge increase from the time of the MCO. So do you think entrepreneurship could be the solution for unemployed millennials during a global pandemic?
It certainly can. And I think, well, I think more immediately, I guess, you know, other references that you made in terms of, you know, the gig economy and side hustles. I think what employment has used to mean in comparison to what it means now with the advent of the gig economy, I think, not questioning the Department of Statistics, of course, but I think it's a case of, I think, understanding what that actually means, because a lot of graduates will have different types of side hustles that will sort of keep things afloat. But I think what people are really, really looking for is trying to find something to really sink their teeth in. And when you talk about entrepreneurship, is really committing yourself, you and maybe others, towards something and building something that has value. And as a result, to your question, yes, it is, but there's almost not enough, I mean, this is just my perspective, but it's actually understanding what it takes to be an entrepreneur, or learning how, because there isn't a school for it necessarily, right? And you can read as many articles as you want, but it is really about throwing yourself in and making mistakes. It'd be great to have a strategy. It'd be great to have a focus group. It'd be great to do a little bit of market research. It'd be great to check with friends and family saying, what do you think about this idea? What do you think about that idea? Now, these steps of in terms of these processes, yes, they're available online, but there's nothing more, like, in terms of my perspective, there's nothing better than a mentorship. Having a mentorship to essentially guide you as to how you can best do this in the best way possible to give yourself the best chance. Where do people go for that? And that's something that I've wondered about in a in a career that 9 years at BFM didn't mean that I figured out everything about media when I first started. I thought, and just because BFM was such a startup radio station, there wasn't really a structure in place for me to learn from someone. I really sort of picked it up on my own. And the same way with entrepreneurship, you pick things up on your own, which is great. But I've been learning more about business management, leadership now, more than ever before, because I realized that these were the things that I wanted when I started my journey, either as a salaried employee or as an entrepreneur. Now, having gone through all those experiences and sort of pairing that with learnings and master classes and all that kind of stuff, then you start having structure, and having that structure as the backbone of your journey is terribly, terribly important, because it allows you, it allows a feedback loop, almost like a classroom setting, to figure out what it is that you can do better and what it is that you should continue on. And without that structure, and if you do it, and that's the thing, that's, I mean, the most amazing thing about when we hear these success stories of entrepreneurs, they hustled and they did everything themselves. But there's a backstory of a huge community around that person that usually has provided counsel, that has provided advice. And I think that's what entrepreneurs, I don't know if the successful ones talk about the amount of people that help them get to that point, because it literally takes a community to get over the line. Even in doing the Ezra Zaid Project, I have great interns that help me, but I have a community of friends who I check in with every week to say, this is where I'm at, this is what I'm doing, and is this any good? Should we try that? And it is having those different voices, especially voices that you don't necessarily agree with, but you value their perspective from where their area of expertise is. That is kind of the thing that actually sort of moves the needle, rather than it kind of being a bit of a cyclical loop. Because there was a point I remember when I was selling books, and I going, I remember asking myself, and we just printed another book that purportedly was going to be a bestseller or whatever, and sold 5,000 copies or whatever. But there was a point where I'm not sure why or who is going to buy this. And that's a scary notion. If you don't know who your audience is, if you don't know the profile, if you don't know the income bracket, if you don't know the category, you can make these sort of educated guesses and see where it lies. But I think having some sort of structure that allows you to sort of oversee why your decision-making process is the way it is helps move things a lot quicker. And then you can leverage on the momentum of motion and improvement. Because when you don't have that, and you just have a kind of wait and see kind of experience, it can be quite debilitating in that sense. And you're hoping for success, then suddenly it's just throwing things against the wall and trying to figure out whether that works or not.
I think in that discussion there, you've actually given sort of millennials some important things that they have to remember, when starting or when sort of being an entrepreneur. And I think one of the points that you mentioned was really interesting, is that it is an individual process. And I think in that process and going through the experiences on your own, you have to sort of take feedback, and you have to have a community that's around with you to help you through that process with the feedback. What other advice would you give to millennial entrepreneurs who are, if we're talking about someone that's starting a business for the first time, or someone that's trying maybe, a second product now that they're trying to sell, whether that product is, through media or through a different form, what kind of advice would you give them?
Easy. Find a mentor and ask them, what can I learn? Eat some humble pie and ask them, how did you do it?
Right.
I've had many sort of different mentors in the past.
Yeah.
And the only regret I have is not asking them sooner. It has to do with some sort of, I don't know, when you're young, just not having, I don't know. It's probably a lot to do with ego, and my therapist has been helping me out with that. But if you can find somebody that you have a trust capacity with, and say, hey, can I borrow an hour of your time a week? Just want to run something by you. Somebody that you trust and has area of expertise in that particular area that you're also participating in, that counsel would accelerate your process and your learnings by so much, rather than what, and of course, and it's while still giving you the opportunity to do it your own way. So it is that still part of that golden mean. So having somebody to provide counsel and context. Friends are great, but somebody who's been there, done that, gone through the trenches, put their money on the line, went down, went up. And I think that's having somebody to speak to is terribly important, because the journey is going to be so tumultuous. It's good. There's going to be so much exciting tumbles, but there's going to be some painful ones as well. And having support like that is terribly important, because it cushions it to a way in which you can anticipate things better. And it's I think that's probably part of the thing with, you and I doing this, not face to face, but the distance in which we have as people right now, we're calling and video calling and all that. Like I'm still very much a person who wants to see you. Let's talk about it, and to generate that. It's really hard nowadays for I guess people to do that, just because technology is just sort of fast tracked it. But I think having that human relationship with someone and asking them what you can learn from them, and it's terribly important, because we're just, we're still people just wanting to know how do I do that? How can I get it better? And find a mentor.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for that, Ezra. I think that was that's great advice. And if if we're talking about someone here, not hypothetical, but but if someone were to listen to your advice, to have a mentor, and if you look at the personalities of millennials, do you think they have what it takes to be successful entrepreneurs? Taking your advice with their personality as millennials, do they have what it takes?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think also just it's really funny, because I have a lot of conversations with my father about business, and he just turned 70, right? and I hear his ideas, right? And then so always there's that germination of the idea that sounds very good, and then suddenly we get sort of tactical about how it should be done. More often than not, that's where I tune out, because the way in which the execution is, it was the way he formulates it was almost of his generation. But the idea I'm in agreement with, because there are different ways to sort of express that idea now, because of technology and all sorts of different ways. And so that's why we almost find some agreement too. And I think the digital natives in which many millennials are so comfortable with, it is a huge advantage, but it is at the end of the day a tool. It is merely a tool. What millennials, like myself and many others, what they need to do is trying to figure out the hard stuff, which is what is of value that other people that I can create that other people want, and really taking the time to figure that out is terribly important, because especially online, the ways in which people can gravitate towards generating wealth, it's there's a little bit of FOMO almost. Like if you're not trading in crypto on a Tuesday, or if you're not selling cakes or, on a weekend, and because it looks like on my Instagram feed that everybody's just making money left, right, and center, which is which is probably the case. And you're like, well, what the heck am I doing? But in fact, I think a lot of the work that's required is actually looking inward. I mean, it's actually looking inward. Do millennials have that capacity? Of course they do, but they will still be subject to all of the tests that have gone through previous generations, which is asking yourself, where do you want to, what is it that you want to do? How are you going to do it? And why do you want to do it? And how will it create value for yourself and others? And I mean, here's my thing, and I'm obviously slightly late to the game and realizing this, but for it to sort of have value for others is usually sort of the thing that sort of comes to mind, so that a transaction can take place, so that people buy your stuff. You need to carve out a small place for yourself. I don't think millennials will have too much problem doing that, but sometimes I've actually sort of forgotten that. I've forgotten that you do need to carve out a small place for the thing that you're doing just for yourself, whatever that might mean in the process of doing it. So if this podcast that I'm making, it's got personal finance stuff, it explores relationships and stories about hope and optimism and all that kind of stuff. But maybe the podcast for me is like, oh, I get to write a theme song. So writing a theme song was just completely mine and mine alone. And the listeners don't know it, but that's really was part of the biggest achievement that I've made in the past 3 months, because that theme song was really hard to write, and it was a collaboration and all that kind of stuff. But people like the content, right? It's for them. So almost a one for them and one for you. That balance is always important.
Nicely put. That's nice. And there's one question that I have at the end, Ezra, which I ask all my guests. And the question is, what is one myth about millennials that you disagree with?
Well, can I ask a question? What are some of the myths of millennials that are in the mix? I'm not quite.
Right. Okay. So
then I'll choose and I'll comment on one.
Absolutely. That's a great way. So some of the answers that I've gotten from my previous guests, one of it was that millennials are lazy. That was one. And then another one was millennials are picky and choosy. So those were the two best ones that I got so far. And what would you say?
Wow. I mean,
but they're myths though, Ezra. So they
sure.
Are meant
well,
to be...
I mean, the problem with myths or stereotypes is, on those two counts, I mean, I'm guilty of both. So like, I'm not quite sure if I'm actually going to help with this question, but to the question about, I'd like to talk about picky, like millennials being, let's go with that. Okay. I work with a lot of young people, and I've worked with a lot of young people for a long time. Videographers and editors and storytellers ranging anywhere from 19 to 25. And I've just been interacting with them for a long time. And somewhere around 2 years ago, I've been working for 13 years. And like somewhere 2 years, like I realized that I had sort of been coaching a generation, right? And it's like I noticed that sort of the group and the profile of the room changed, and the jokes changed. And I don't know if you have this as an educator, as a lecturer, like you literally see like the temperature or something changing within the profile of the kids in the room. And it is not so much picky. It is just not knowing what to do with the abundance of choice. And it is. I don't envy, like, I remember like conversations with my parents being so similar in that because of the lack of choice that they had, it was almost so easy to go into whether, but by the time I had graduated with a degree or whatever. Like the choice was, you could do anything. You could go in oil and gas, you could. But if I was, somebody coming into the job market right now, I have huge empathy for the uncertainty of what is it that it's not that there's so much picky so much, but there isn't really that sort of compass. Or I mean, I don't think school necessarily and even tertiary education, I don't think they're preparing human beings. I think, like, not going on a whole Sir Ken Robinson rant, but like, our education systems right now are still a response to the Industrial Revolution, right? You're not really responding to the needs of what you need to make a human being from ages 0 to 18 or whatever. And so they're picky because of the abundance of choice. But what they also have is that they have I think that they can find community now. You can find community in ways in which before, because of technology, you couldn't quite find it. Maybe you could, in the 90s, it was an MIRC chat room or something. You found community there. But now I think it's easier to find community. I think, and as a result, when you can find community, you can express and pick and respond to that cycle a lot easier than it used to be. But it doesn't mean that it's, and even that the abundance of choices is evident. But I think that's why finding a circle of sorts, friends, family, mentor, it helps you sort of reduce the noise a little bit, and it allows you to sort of to test your own. Finding one's voice as a millennial is a challenging and daunting thing to do, simply because you're told now that do what you want and have passion in what you do and do what you love, and you'll never work a day in your life. It's far more complex than that, unfortunately. It's terribly more complex, and I think but I think the opportunity to connect now is tremendous. I think the opportunity to make something and to change and move and improve from your station in life is huge as well. So it's exciting, just terribly daunting too.
Yeah, no, I think I think that nicely sums up what we've been discussing. I think and I think millennials, they have challenges, I think, in what you said as well, with the options and the opportunities that we have. That could be a double-edged sword as well sometimes. I think having all those options can be a difficult thing as well.
Preti, can I ask, from your conversations with other folks who've been talking about this, like, I mean, so millennials, what 80 something to?
So my previous sort of I guess the kind of people that I had before this were in the 90s. So they were 93 and 95. People were born in 93 and 95. So they're the 90s of millennials.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it does feel like, I think, at this current juncture, that the, millennials have gotten a grasp of things, I think, that, or are in the process of grasping and making it more familiar and comfortable. I think the other future generations, I mean, I always look at my nephew and niece, right? 5 and 10, and I'm looking at them and trying to think, wow, the way they're talking, the way they're communicating, just the processes, and it's on fire almost. Right. I always wonder. I mean, I can imagine that all of the choices that we're talking about, it's going to be nothing compared to those kids. That's true. I don't know what advice that I would necessarily give, to because it is getting harder. It is getting harder and harder in that sense.
Yeah, but I think they have what it takes. I think teaching. I think people around the age of your nephew and niece, I think there's something very special about that generation, the generation to come. We call them the newer generation, and I think that's one thing that's particularly unique about them. It's that they have that technology, but it goes beyond that. It's knowing, from the age of 5, some of them knowing how to use an iPad and knowing how to use it well. And I think that could be a really powerful thing by the time they, reach, their 20s. And I think it'll be interesting. I think it'll be hugely interesting to see what they get up to when they reach this age.
Preti, we didn't speak about this offline. I hope you don't mind us talking about this on the podcast. But
absolutely,
what was the premise of you starting this podcast?
So yeah, I think well, the premise is that when I go about my job as a teacher, and it's a very exciting thing, but I have lots of questions that come up in my mind about me being a teacher, a new teacher, being a millennial, and having sort of different ideas. And I started thinking, do we have a platform for millennials to talk about these things, to answer some of these questions that we have in mind? And I found that there wasn't really much of a space for us to communicate and to share our opinions. And I think that was the main goal for starting this podcast. So that was the reason, really. It was wanting to give a platform.
And have you found in your conversations, and what are some of the things that you've noticed from the conversations about these issues?
What I've noticed is that millennials have their own frustrations, and that was interesting. That was really interesting to see. And I think the previous, I had Dinesh, one of my university mates, in the last podcast. It was really interesting to see that fire in him when he was talking about the frustrations that he had to go through in the field of human resource. So he's in HR and those frustrations. And then previously I had another university mate of mine, and his frustrations on sort of being labeled as, a lazy millennial. And it was really interesting to have that input from them. And another thing that came up from my discussions with both of them is that as millennials, we're finding that it's the generation that comes before us that's giving voice to us, and it's not us that's giving voice to ourselves, in a sense. People are always analyzing, oh, millennials are this, millennials are that, and trying to understand millennials. Right. But why don't we do it? Why don't we tell you what we are and what we are like?
Yes, and I can fully relate. And I think part of it is also, I mean, I'm trying to think of what are some of like my pet peeves in that regard. And to be honest, and I think sort of I alluded to this earlier, is it was when I was a radio presenter on a radio station, I couldn't tell you how much joy it gave my mom. And do you know why that is? It wasn't so much that I had a job, it wasn't so much that I had salary. She knew what to say. She knew what to say to auntie. She knew what to say that my son works in a radio station.
Right.
And I realized just in that moment, by that point, I had already sort of worked 5-6 years, but I really didn't understand what this whole digital thing was. Yeah. And I realized I didn't know why it was important necessarily, because she knows that I carved out a thing for myself. She knows that I can figure things out. And so, but it is having, I guess, for me, it was like, don't you know what I do? Yeah. Like, I think that is such a very interesting thing, because and it will happen to my nephew and niece, where I will be asking them, so what is it that you do exactly? Like, I'm pretty sure I'm gonna be like exactly like my mom was to me. And I think that's like quite surreal, just knowing that moment is coming where I'm not sure where things are headed, and it's exciting, I guess.
I mean, history always repeats itself in different ways. So I think, I think I would have to reflect on this experience, I think, when I reached that age, and, saying those things, and then maybe doing it, being guilty of doing those things as well. It would be, it'd be a full sort of circle that I'll come around to. And I think,
Preti, do you think, I mean, just while we're on this conversation about your podcast,
sure.
Like, do you feel that that there's something that's not being heard of in terms of the millennial experience, or is there something that's sort of missing, and do you have a sense as to what that is?
I think I had a sense, I reflect on myself a lot with this journey, because, there wasn't really, like I said, there wasn't much that I could find, on the internet or anywhere really, where there was, millennials sharing their opinions and what they feel. So it had to be a bit of a reflective journey. But I think something that I've realized, having done a few episodes, is that I think what we're missing out, or what is not out there, is when it comes to the millennial experience, it's definitely sort of the feelings of millennials. I think that's not being shared in the way that that needs to be shared. I think, yes, we talk about what millennials are like with jobs. There's tons of articles about millennials, leaving after 2 years, because they always want that constant push and that constant drive that they don't get after 2 years. But there isn't really much about what we feel, about what we think about things. And I think it's that emotional factor that I've realized is sort of, there's a bit of a gap in the market for that.
Yeah, I would say so too. And I think I think and almost, when you see sort of younger people, and I think about younger people like Greta Thunberg, who's like, just, I mean, you're a teenager and you're changing the world, right?
Exactly.
And I always feel that, millennials were sort of the bridge that allowed for that to happen. Like, and I think that in that sense, certainly, I am more in tune with sort of all the things that are happening internally with myself, and I reflect on, was that the case necessary for the previous generation? And I think always, like, we sort of have these sort of marginal software updates, I guess, for each generation that has this ability to sort of articulate and communicate yourself in a better manner. But at the same time, one of the good things in some ways is that, like, as a millennial, like, critical thinking is like an important thing, right? It's an important tool to have. I do wonder whether, just with the advent of how we communicate over text and being politically correct and cancel culture, it almost feels like that future generations are entering into a zone that I did not experience, which was like in university, you could speak, have an opinion about an issue, the other person in the hall would say something opposing, but you could still go for a meal after and not be sort of blocked on Twitter because they had an opposing view or something. So seeing that the advent of that change from my generation to that is certainly been interesting for me, because it seems that it's sort of created some sort of a rapid change in the way social discourse takes place as well.
Yeah, no, I think well, I guess only time will tell what happens with that, with the next generation. But yeah, I think it'll be fascinating to see what happens when we move on to, when we take the back step and we let the next generation take the front step.
For sure.
It'll be interesting. So Ezra, thank you so much for your input today. I think that was a really very interesting episode, I think, in so many ways, with some of the insights that you gave on entrepreneurship, on millennial culture, millennial sort of emotions as well. So it'll be great to have you again in the future, hopefully. And thank you so much for coming today.
Preti, thank you for having me on. I'm not sure exactly if anything I say is worth very much, but if it made some sort of sense to one person out there, then this would have been a success. And congratulations on doing this. And I know it's a lot of effort and time and energy, but I think the more important thing is that clearly you're enjoying this, and I think that's a great thing that you're writing on. So congratulations on having this podcast.
Thank you so much, Ezra. And if anyone has not heard the Ezra Zaid Project, please go ahead right now to Spotify and to any other, I think, platforms where you can get podcasts. Have a listen to it. I truly enjoy listening to the Ezra Zaid Project on so many levels. There are so many great things, even with the auditory experience that I get listening to the podcast. It's a great thing to learn from as well. So thank you so much, Ezra, for doing that.
Thanks, Preti.
Well. Yeah.
Thank you very much.